On April 2nd, 2025, President Donald Trump announced sweeping tariffs on more than 90 countries, a day he declared Liberation Day.
We have been ripped off for decades by nearly every country on earth, and we will not let that happen any longer.
Within just 2 days, the S&P 500 had wiped out nearly $5 trillion in value. The move was sold as a bold correction, a way to fix America's massive trade deficit and spark an economic rebirth. For a while, it seemed to work. Recent figures show the U.S. economy growing by over 4%, one of the strongest performances in the developed world. But those numbers hide a deeper story. 9 months later, the promise of revival has turned into something else entirely. Factories are closing, jobs are vanishing, and the trade deficit had reached a new record high. This is the story of how a well-intentioned trade policy became one of the most economically destructive decisions in modern U.S. history. When Donald Trump returned to power, he promised one thing above all: to bring back manufacturing jobs to America's factory towns. After World War II, America's industrial base has been shrinking. Manufacturing fell from a quarter of the economy to barely, employing just 8% of workers. Trump's fix was simple: tariffs, make imports more expensive, and push demand back toward American-made goods. But since Liberation Day, manufacturing sector has lost more than 60,000 jobs, signaling not just layoffs, but a collapse in future hiring. The very policy meant to save factories ended up destroying them. Because you can't shield an industry from competition without exposing it to uncertainty. Tariff rates changed almost weekly, leaving manufacturers unable to plan long-term investments, sign stable contracts, or hire with confidence. Then came the second part: input costs. Modern U.S. factories run on global supply chains: electronics, auto parts, industrial machinery, and many of those components are imported. When tariffs hit, costs surged overnight and margins shrank. Companies had only two options: absorb the losses or pass them to consumers. Either way, competitiveness eroded. Goldman Sachs estimates American consumers bear more than half of the total tariff burden, and the data reflects it. The ISM Manufacturing Index has contracted for 9 straight months. Productivity growth has slowed to just 0.5% a year, even as R&D spending hit record levels. Firms are investing more in innovation, but getting less in return. The reason is tariff-driven uncertainty and higher costs holding back big capital projects. And the shock didn't stay inside the factory gates. More than 700 companies filed for bankruptcy, the highest in 15 years. Tariffs made imports costlier, pushing prices up at home and squeezing consumers, and the pain spread across the economy. That forced the Federal Reserve into a trap: raise interest rates to cool inflation or cut them to protect growth. Both options carried consequences. Higher rates risked deeper layoffs. Lower rates encouraged speculation instead of real investment. Money flooded into stocks rather than small businesses, while manufacturers starved for demand. Inflation rose to 2.7%, high by developed world standards, and unemployment climbed above 4.6%. Across retail giants and industrial icons, profits fell sharply. Alongside tariffs, the Trump administration began enforcing much stricter immigration policies. The idea was to reduce reliance on foreign labor and push firms to hire domestically. But rebuilding a skilled workforce takes years, and many manufacturing states relied on immigrants for roughly a quarter of their industrial roles. So when workers began disappearing, projects stalled. In Georgia, ICE detained and deported hundreds of South Korean specialists, helping set up a high-end dye plant. Across the country, construction sites froze mid-project, factories ran below capacity, and entire local economies buckled. Not because demand was gone, but because the workers were. In a brutal twist of fate, the two headline policies meant to revive the heartland, tariffs and migration cuts, ended up hitting those same states the hardest. And while the failure to revive manufacturing is now well documented, what most people don't realize is this: the damage didn't stop there. It spread fast into another industry: agriculture. Heartland states generate nearly a quarter of their GDP from agriculture, growing soybeans and corn at massive scale and selling them worldwide. When the U.S. places tariffs on China, in retaliation, China slapped duties of up to 25% on soybeans, corn, and pork. The fallout was immediate. Key buyers vanished overnight. Prices for those crops, already weak from global oversupply, collapsed further, with estimated losses of roughly $44 billion across the 2025 to 26. Across the Midwest, some farmers couldn't sell at any price. Fields of unsold crops were left to rot, losses topping $3 billion in some states. Even farms still operating are hanging by a thread, with profit margins now razor thin. But the crisis runs deeper than falling prices. For decades, American agriculture has relied on migrant labor to do backbreaking, seasonal work that most citizens won't. But immigration restrictions results in farm labor shortages at a 20-year high. In some areas, vacancy rates exceed 40%. And when you can't find workers, you can't harvest your crops, no matter the price. Farmers face a brutal squeeze. Collapsing prices from tariffs, higher input costs on imported machinery, and now, a critical labor shortage. Every leg of the agricultural stool has been kicked out at once. In just the first half of 2025, 181 farms filed for bankruptcy. The value of agricultural futures has fallen more than 20% since 2022, the steepest decline in over a decade. For tens of thousands of farmers, those margin calls have been the final blow. The Trump administration responded with a $12 billion aid package. Economists say it won't matter. They project up to 100,000 farms could vanish by 2030. That's not a statistic, it's the remapping of rural America. And here's the part that should worry everyone watching. This crisis doesn't stay in the fields. Those losses ripple through the entire economy. When a farm fails, the debt doesn't disappear. It gets transferred to the regional banks, credit unions, and agricultural lenders who financed it. Over $450 billion in agricultural lending is now exposed to the deteriorating conditions in farming. Think about what that means. The bank's capital shrinks. Its ability to lend to other customers declines. Its capital ratios move toward regulatory minimums. If the crisis spreads across multiple banks in a region, you get a cascade of losses that can quickly spiral out of control. 1 in 5 banks in the Chicago Federal Reserve District, which covers much of America's agricultural heartland, has raised collateral requirements for farm loans. None have eased their requirements. This suggests that bankers, who have direct knowledge of their portfolios, are preparing for deterioration. They're raising the bar for new lending and squeezing existing borrowers because they expect conditions to worsen. And this brings us to a broader, more troubling reality. America's economy has become so indebted and fragile that even modest shocks now trigger serious financial stress across households. U.S. household debt has reached record levels, with credit card balances and home equity borrowing both at new highs as families increasingly rely on debt simply to maintain their standard of living. Delinquencies are rising across the credit spectrum, and for the first time, even borrowers with solid credit scores are beginning to fall behind. The vulnerability is not confined to rural or agricultural regions. It is visible in major urban centers and service-based economies as well. In several states, household debt-to-income ratios now exceed 130%, meaning the average household owes more than 1.3 years of income. This debt buildup was made possible by nearly a decade of ultra-low interest rates following the 2008 financial crisis. When borrowing is cheap, households and businesses accumulate debt aggressively. But interest rates do not remain near zero indefinitely. Beginning in 2022, the Federal Reserve was forced to raise rates to contain inflation, abruptly increasing the cost of servicing that accumulated debt. At the same time, tariffs have quietly amplified household stress by acting as a stealth tax on consumption. Estimates suggest the average household is paying roughly $1,300 in tariff-related costs in 2025, with another $1,600 expected in 2026. Together, These price increases effectively erase 2 to 3% of a median family's gross income. Inflation expectations have jumped sharply, with outlooks reaching their highest levels in decades. The central bank itself expects most tariff costs to be passed on to consumers, keeping core inflation elevated well into the second half of the decade. The result is a tightening vice. Wage growth slowed, while debt payments surged. As purchasing power erodes, households lean further on credit. Delinquencies rise. And once consumer spending slows, the stress spreads outward through the economy. The cumulative damage from the tariff regime is now unmistakable. Real GDP is projected to be 2.1% lower by 2026 and to remain below its baseline trajectory through 2034, implying a permanent reduction in economic output of roughly $90 billion annually in real terms. While the tariffs are expected to raise approximately $2.7 trillion in fiscal revenue over the next decade, slower growth offsets much of that gain, turning the policy into a one-time revenue grab that permanently shrinks the economic pie. Employment outcomes mirror this deterioration, with unemployment rising by as much as 0.6 percentage points in 2026, equivalent to roughly 1 million workers either unemployed or working fewer hours. The tariffs have also proven structurally inflationary, pushing prices higher, forcing the Federal Reserve to maintain tighter monetary policy for longer, and creating a damaging mix of slower growth and elevated inflation pressures. Consumer confidence has collapsed to historic lows. Exports have declined sharply due to retaliation and weakened global demand, and investment has slowed as uncertainty clouds long-term planning. Yet reversing course has become politically difficult. Tariff revenues are now embedded in budget projections. Farmers rely on compensatory subsidies, and domestic lobbies have grown dependent on the promise of protection. The result is policy inertia. High tariffs persist despite their failure to deliver promised gains, locking in reduced productivity, weaker competitiveness, and distorted supply chains for years to come. The tariffs may not trigger an immediate recession, but they have made the U.S. economy less resilient, less dynamic, and more vulnerable to future shocks. In a deeply integrated global economy, the evidence is increasingly clear. Protectionism intended to defend growth has instead undermined it, and the long-term costs are being borne by workers, households, and businesses across the country.